Blinken-occupied government. Tony Blinken is heading to Israel today to try to clinch a ceasefire deal. Here comes the clincher.
Yeah, it's a clincher. Yeah. Like I joked on Twitter, this is like pyromaniac. Sorry, arsenic heads to pyromaniac to try to clinch a ceasefire.
An extinguishment.
That's the equivalent of that Times headline right there. How many times has Blinken gone to Israel to clinch a ceasefire? It's just such a ridiculous farce. And now what are they doing? We've already mentioned it multiple times, but it's worth stressing. They're basically letting Israel author the ceasefire proposal, remove calls for a permanent ceasefire, let Israel impose its conditions where it retains a permanent presence in the Philadelphia corridor, which, Max, I know you're very well versed in. You can speak about the significance of that, and also put Israel in charge of vetting civilians returning to their homes in the north. So basically, after we've destroyed your homes, after we've destroyed your territory, we're going to put ourselves there to make sure you can't do anything that we don't like that but might possibly resist us. I mean, why would a Palestinian ever agree to that? To let these mass murderers have a role in policing them as they try to rebuild under already impossible conditions.
Yeah. So here's a flashback to Tony Blinken during his first trip to Israel. He's made 9 trips. So I guess for each trip, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people are slaughtered in Gaza each time he goes. These have been really effective at clinching ceasefires. It's almost like he's doing something else there and kind of buying time.
If you'll permit me, personal aside, I come before you not only as the United States Secretary of State, but also as a Jew. My grandfather, Maurice Blinken, fled pogroms in Russia. My stepfather, Samuel Pizar, survived concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek. So, Prime Minister, I understand on a personal level the harrowing echoes that Hamas's massacres carry for Israeli Jews, indeed, for Jews everywhere. I also come before you as a husband and father of young children. It's impossible for me to look at the photos of families killed, such as the mother, father, and 3 small children murdered as they sheltered in their home in kibbutz near Oz, and not think of my own children. This was just one of Hamas's countless acts of terror, in a litany of brutality and inhumanity that, yes, brings to mind the worst of ISIS.
I mean, it's really wild to look back at that. There's so much, and this is why it's taken 10 months for Blinken to get back to clinching a ceasefire. He's at fault here. Everything he said there set the stage for what was to actually happen, in which children were deliberately slaughtered. He lied about what took place at kibbutz near Oz there. It was his first lie. Only 1 baby was killed on October 7th, and it was in an accidental shot through a safe room door, Mila Cohen. Blinken lied on October 31st before the Senate about a family being tortured to death while children were mutilated by Hamas. But there he likens October 7th to the Holocaust, brings up his own family and says he's come there as a Jew, which forfeits all diplomatic leverage. He's not a diplomat. He's not looking at both sides. He's not going to assess October 7th in the context of the occupation. He's there as a Jew who sides with Israel on an ethno-religious basis. So there's no diplomatic leverage. He forfeited it all right there. He brings up his grandfather, Maurice Blinken, who actually presided over one of the first studies arguing that the colonization of Palestine could be economically profitable for the Zionist movement. He was an Israel lobbyist. He brings up his stepfather, Samuel Pizar, who was rescued from concentration camps, not by the Zionist movement or by the U.S. military, but by the Soviet Red Army. Blinken never mentions that. Samuel Pizar was himself an Israel lobbyist in France, Jewish consigliere to Francois Mitterrand and close friend of Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell. So that's who's been running the show partly all this time. And every time Blinken goes there, he went back in November and he sat in on an Israeli war cabinet meeting. When do you ever see that take place? Where a genocide is taking place, Israel was in the process of destroying Gaza City and storming the Al-Shifa hospital, which Blinken and Biden falsely claimed was a Hamas headquarters. That's been totally debunked, setting the stage for the destruction of the rest of the hospitals. And Blinken sits in on a war cabinet meeting. Very unusual. When have we ever heard him express his horror at the slaughter of some 2,500 babies in Gaza as a father who dressed his son up as Vladimir Zelensky last Halloween? I mean, this is one of the biggest diplomatic, I would say it's not one of the biggest diplomatic failures. It's one of the biggest diplomatic coups in support of Israeli apartheid. And it's why people are in the streets in Chicago right now. Tony Blinken I think he's going to fail again because they're not pushing for a permanent ceasefire. They're not pushing for people to be able to return to their homes in the north. Israel's determined to wipe out northern Gaza because they know that the actual government of Gaza will reconstitute there, Hamas, and they're determined to cut off Gaza from Egypt and control the flow of humanitarian aid to starve people out. And Blinken, his bridging proposal doesn't really contain any terms that will challenge that.
Since you mentioned Blinken's stepfather and surviving the Nazi death camps, I just want to mention this book. It's called In the Shadow of the Holocaust, The Struggle Between Jews and Zionists in the Aftermath of World War II. The struggle between Jews and Zionists.
It's a great
book. What was that struggle? It was the Zionists were trying to force the survivors of the Nazi death camps to go to Palestine, to be colonizers, to go, after, suffering through, this genocidal regime in Europe, to go off to Palestine and fight and steal land. And there was a struggle. Many people did not want to go off to Palestine. They wanted to go to America or other places, live in peace and not engage in another conflict. But this is one of the rare books that goes into it. It's actually, I believe the author is Israeli, Yosef Grodzinski, but it's a great book, totally overlooked history. And since, like just talking about Blinken parroting all the Israeli lies about October 7th, the beheaded babies and comparing them to ISIS, when again, what Israel's done in Gaza is incomparably worse than anything ISIS has ever done. I mean, that's why UMax called them JSIL, because they're comparable to ISIS and that they're both religious fanatics. But of course, nothing compares to Israeli atrocities. But I'm just wondering, do you think we'll ever get a U.S. major media outlet to acknowledge that the Hamas rape allegations were a complete scam? I don't think we'll ever get anyone to acknowledge that. I think for as long as we're around, it just won't happen. That lie is too big to fail. It's kind of like the OPCW whistleblowers. They're not allowed to exist. And, likewise with the Hamas rape scam, the truth there is not allowed to exist because it was so foundational to the narrative to not only, continue the mass murder campaign, but also to cover up Israel's actual use of sexual abuse, torture, rape against Palestinian prisoners. Maybe we'll get some reporting because it's happened in Israel already about the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. There's been some passing mention of it in the New York Times, but again, nothing like what you see in the Grayzone and electronic intifada. But I just wonder if we'll ever get an acknowledgement of what we all know to be true, which is that there was no rape, there were obviously no beheaded babies, and Israel did kill some people on October 7th.
Yeah, well, we'll get. I mean, this is the blockbuster scandal. Is not only was there no rape, Israel is openly declaring. Israelis are openly declaring support for documented cases of the sexual assault on Palestinian men, the sodomization of Palestinian men in Israel's torture camps like Sde Teman and the Ofer military prison in the occupied West Bank. It's all out in the open. The perpetrators of these rapes have unmasked themselves because they're being portrayed as kind of victim heroes in Israeli society. And a new poll by the Israel Democracy Institute shows that a majority of Israelis oppose criminal charges being brought against their confessed rapists of Palestinian men. By the way, this is the policy supported by American Christian Zionists in the Republican Party, the sodomization of Palestinian prisoners. And that scandal has not made its way to U.S. media either. I mean, it was framed as a battle for Israel's soul on page A13 in the New York Times. You have now one of the highest level resignations in any transatlantic government, with a British Foreign Office longtime diplomat, Mark Smith, resigning on the grounds that Israel's committing war crimes and that Britain is complicit in these war crimes. And he specifically calls out Israel's rape and torture of Palestinian prisoners as those war crimes. And British media, BBC, like two just had him on the radio, but British media ignored it for at least 24 hours, completely ignored it, which caused me to wonder if they had imposed some kind of D notice on this resignation. He's calling out Israel for systemic rape. And we got portrayed as rape apologists for denying the hoax, or debunking, not denying. We debunked the hoax on October 7th. We were smeared in the Washington Post twice for that. The Washington Post hasn't covered any of this.